we are here in our first interview of a free interview series with resourcing and experts from the field of responsible sourcing. And as our first guest, I have the honor to invite Mr. Stefan Kretz. Could you introduce yourself briefly and your organization?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. So my name is indeed Stefan Kretz, Executive Director of CSR Europe. And CSR Europe is a sustainability network of mainly multinational companies working on all aspects of sustainability with its members and from different sectors. Specifically also CSR Europe, and I think for this work on raw materials is more important, is we also facilitate a partnership between 18 automotive companies, OEMs, on supply chain sustainability, all aspects supply chain sustainability, going from their common guiding principles, their common assessments of tier one suppliers, but also on how they deal with sustainability issues in their supply chain. And next to that, we also run other what we call collaborative platforms like Drive Sustainability. We have something on responsible trucking. We have something on tax transparency, etc. But I think for this interview, I will mainly leverage the experience from the automotive sector in Drive Sustainability. Yeah.
Right, which is welcome because Drive Sustainability, of course, has a pretty big brand name. So it's a heavy weight, and it's would be interesting if you could say something about that.
Yeah.
Before we start with that, I mean, we are both here witnessing or attending the Raw Material Summit. You were in the panel yesterday. I have a specific question to that panel, but
okay.
Before that, maybe just a general view. I mean, responsible sourcing, let's say, has not been a key topic of this year's edition of the Raw Material Summit, but of course, it always features somewhere. So what's your, let's say, takeaway message or takeaway messages from this summit for your organization?
Especially from the session yesterday, but I think also in general, it's and I think, but also for the automotive sector in general, it's an engagement agenda, responsible sourcing. It's not, for us at least, and there is a lot of regulatory expectation now and regulation being put out there on how do you map your supply chains, how do you perform your due diligence, and how are you transparent about it as an individual company. And that is worthwhile in the level playing field. I think that was discussed yesterday as well. But the real issue is how do you make more sustainable supply chains? I mentioned in my presentation yesterday, from a purchasing side, you look traditionally at cost, quality, and timely delivery. Two elements are added to that now. One is the availability, the access to the material. Also, given the new geopolitical situation, becomes much more challenging. Second is, what is the level of sustainability in that material or with that material, in the sourcing with that material? So as a purchasing in a multinational company, be it automotive or another, there are now 5 elements instead of 3. And purchasing was already, I come from automotive sector, purchasing was already very challenging at time, cost, and quality. But with those 2 elements, it becomes even more challenging. And so the only way, or an important way forward is a mutual engagement. It's an engagement between peers or between competitors, like we do in automotive. Together, you have more impact than alone, and it's more cost efficient. But it's also engagement within your value chain. How do you, as an individual company or as a group of companies, engage with your value chain, with the smelters, refiners, the mining, etc. How do you make sure that they are not alone? You can, of course, put requirements to your supplier, but only putting the requirement is checking the box. It doesn't change anything on the ground necessarily.
Right.
So how do you engage? So that is the responsible sourcing became therefore part of a bigger challenge on sourcing in general. I think, yeah.
And it's interesting when you mention those 5 points, because when you look at cost and quality, I mean, these are, let's say, you can measure this by quantities, by numbers. Whereas when you go to level of sustainability, this is much more difficult. And I think then what you mentioned, engagement comes in, because how do you assess it? Through engagement. And before we talked briefly about the Africa Maval project, about sourcing in Africa. And of course, I would think already that, let's say, for the African partners, sustainable mining might mean something else than it does for European off-takers.
Yeah.
The livelihoods aspect, for instance. So,
yeah.
So this, let's say, equalization of different sustainability standards probably only comes about through this engagement processes.
It is indeed, and I'm glad you mentioned that. And actually, in a meeting before this, I was discussing that with someone. Of course, from a European perspective, of course, we are maybe a little bit too Eurocentric, and maybe also with the risk of some neocolonialism with regard to sourcing from non-European countries. Because, of course, there are standards of work, standards of human rights, standards of environmental protection, etc. They are the standards to strive towards, and they are important. But you cannot legislate them as such, meaning you cannot legislate the outcome. You have to have a sustainable supply chain. No, you have to work with your partners towards a sustainable supply chain. How do you, and the same is in Europe, we do a project on, I mentioned earlier, maybe on responsible trucking. This is about labor conditions in the truck sector in Europe, between France and Sweden, or between Spain and Sweden. What is the labor condition of those workers? Living 6 months on the road, sleeping on parkings for 6 months throughout, doing the kind of a delivery of the oranges to Sweden or the cupboards to Spain. So it's about how do you improve, and the way to improve is an engagement activity. If you source from countries where living conditions, where governance conditions are not the same as in Europe, how can you cannot only look at the mine and say you need to have this or that, because around the mine there is a whole community that doesn't have access to that. So how do you deal with that? Is that then only the responsibility of the mine? No, it's the responsibility also of the government. It's the responsibility of the NGOs, of the development agencies. How do you bring that together? That's an engagement agenda on the responsible sourcing, I would think.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. And just coming back to this, let's say, points and making the purchasing process a bit more complex. I witnessed your panel yesterday. I think it was Mastering the Energy Crisis was the name. And it was the CEO from Aluminium Europe, who was basically looking at the energy supply side and saying there's a potential that the high energy prices, has at least the danger to, he didn't say kick out the aluminium industry, but let's say push it out.
Yeah, and he showed even a map saying 50% reduction already happened now of production capacity. 50%.
Exactly. I mean, it's a lot, and I thought this whole panel was very eye-opening because it was also, really looking at the situation on the ground without any beautification, let's say. What I want to ask, I mean, if now industry in Europe is experiencing this high stress levels, do you think that the additional requirements, and these are not easy requirements that are put on industry by way of responsible sourcing requirements, is that an additional competitiveness risk? Because in other countries, you don't have that. So you could just say, I do my business by pure numbers, and that's it.
What creates the issue in the aluminium sector was energy prices, was not the ESG standards. So I don't think the ESG standards ever will become a kind of challenge of competitiveness. And also, if you look at, we discussed very briefly yesterday, what is it, the cross-border tax, carbon tax mechanism, that helps to create a level playing field, I would think. On the other hand, it's at odds with the single market, especially with the World Trade Organization. So I think things go hand in hand. The consideration of ESG requirements, think of mining, if I go back to mining. We have all kind of ESG requirements towards mining in Africa or in Asia, etc. For example, rights of indigenous people. We also say, and that is about the accessibility of materials to the European industry.
Yeah.
We also say we need more mining activity in Europe, where we also have indigenous people, where there's also environmental protection laws, where there is also this. So I think it's the same thing, basically. And
Right.
and what was emphasized yesterday, the need for an investment agenda, both on the mining sector and also on the manufacturing sector in Europe is needed for this diversification agenda. That you do that with the same type of ESG standards, but also the way to approach it as an engagement agenda and not as a compliance agenda, I think is equal both, be it in Africa, Asia, or Europe, or Canada, or Australia, whatever.
Right. Yeah. Well, then you almost answered my next question.
Oh, sorry.
That I wanted to ask as a follow-up. I mean, because you mentioned it, I mean, mining will also return to Europe if you so want. I mean, there will be more open pits, more underground mining, more processing in Europe than over the last 30 years for sure. Do you think that's a welcoming development from European actors, because you have, let's say, the topic of responsible sourcing a bit closer to home, a bit better under control? I mean, you have this maybe the same challenges, but I think it's easier to know what's going on around your Norwegian pit than what's happening in a Ugandan pit. So
Yeah. I think that's good. To solve the issues will be equally difficult. Maybe the visibility is higher, and the governance, of course, in Europe is different than in other countries. And but that's all good. It will speed us up on the ESG standards. So I think this evolution is a very good evolution, because first of all, it will secure accessibility of materials. And it's not only about mining, it's also about the recycling, the circularity capacity, etc. But be more industrial with it is a good agenda. And that it goes with the same standards, but also with the similar difficulties. Think of the example of indigenous people also in Sweden and Norway, who are already complaining about this evolution of the materials we need for the green transition. So I think it's the same. I think it's a good evolution, and we cannot play anymore, because that's what Europe maybe did for too long. Let's bring the materials in from the outside. We don't have to suffer from the conditions of it, from the fallback, and we put the requirements also to them, to the others, and they have to follow. If not, we do not check the box. That's not the agenda anymore. Although, and I think maybe that is something, if I may be a little bit harsher, all these due diligence laws and regulations in Europe, in be it the deforestation or the CSR 3D, or they are very good from from a level playing field perspective. But they individualize too much the responsibility towards companies. You have to do your due diligence. You have to do your checking. You have to request your supplier to follow A, B, or C. It's very individual, which does not automatically lead to the engagement agenda we started with earlier. Because you can do, and you can say, I'm going to escape from sourcing from there, or pretending that you are escaping from sourcing from A or B, but it doesn't change anything for the people, and it makes your sourcing more difficult. So how to better, beyond the common due diligence for that is individualized and individualized responsibility, make it a collective responsibility. The sourcing from Congo is challenging. Yes, we all know that, because of the current situation, because of the level of education, because of the poverty in the population, because of wars on its borders, well, not only on its border, inside in the east, etc. How do you tackle that from a political point of view, diplomacy, from a international partnership point of view, from a supply point of view? We have a common interest on that one. namely stability, socioeconomic development, etc. So why putting only responsibility towards individual companies? And why not collaborate? This is something, well, what we try to do with Drive Sustainability is to create also this type of thinking. Where can we go to the mining sector? We go to the Cobalt Institute or to the copper mark or all this, the lithium or the aluminium association. How can we engage on these sustainability topics collectively and for improvement rather than individuals saying this is the standard? That is something we're trying to do now. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned something, escape the sourcing from a certain locality. I think the interesting thing about when we look at the raw materials industry, the mining industry, is that this doesn't really work as well generally. I mean, if you have a textile factory in Belgium is too strict, you go to Romania. If that is too strict, you go to Bangladesh.
Yeah.
But the mining industry, of course, has to follow the geology in a way.
Yeah.
But still, to come back then to the resourcing topic, I sometimes had a bit of a fear that being, I don't know if I should say being too strict on ESG, but for example, there was the case that BMW, for instance, did not buy cobalt in Congo, which many people believe they would do, but then I think it's sourced in Morocco and Australia. That was at the time when there was a lot of stories about the child labor mining in
ASM,
Congolese cobalt mines,
yeah.
which is true, but it might at certain occasions also have been a bit exaggerated. But do you see that there's a danger of, scaring basically useful investors away by being too strict on standards?
But it's not about being too strict on standards. It's about how to react and work with standards. Is a standard something absolute? And if it's not there, I shy away from it. And I do not comment on this specific BMW case. But the question is, what is the reaction of a company? Of course, the standard is the standard. That's okay. But is the standard something that had to be achieved now? And if not, you do not source from there? Or is the standard something as an ambition where you work towards achieving it? And then you engage, you do not run away. I'm not in favor of applying different standards or having a leaner or a kind of softer version. No, we want sustainable livelihoods for peoples, we want workers to be protected, we want human rights to be respected, and we want the environment also to do well. That's the direction we all share. How do you get there? If you think there is good cost, quality, timely delivery of your materials in a certain region, can you still have access to it? Will be the next question. Also, over time, better to diversify in any case, because you never know what happens. But also, does it have the potential to meet my ESG requirements? And how do we make it work? Coming from automotive, quality from a supplier is also not a given. Automotive companies, they engage with their suppliers on the quality of what is delivered. It's not that the quality just comes like that. Quality is something you make together. And of course, you do that with your more strategic suppliers, with your suppliers you have a longer term partnership with. So why can't we have longer term partnerships and engagement, maybe more collectively than individually, with your suppliers at the materials that you are using, or with the value chain of the materials? So it's a little bit the same thing. Good quality comes from engagement with your supplier.
Right.
Good ESG, and it's not there like that automatically. The quality of an engine or of a component of an engine is not that top from the start. The designers are making, they are talking to you. So maybe we have to keep that kind of image in mind. ESG is like quality, always to be improved. But I come from Toyota, so there's never perfection.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting view, indeed, and I didn't hear it, formulated like that. So I think there's a whole approach behind that.
Actually.
Yeah.
I just came up with it.
Well, I think we're almost at the end, but at the end, I want to give you the chance to, because we mentioned, or we talked about basically the complexities of CSR, of ESG. You also mentioned some regulations. There's different national due diligence requirements. We have OECD guidelines. So it's a complex network. How does CSR Europe help its clients to navigate these waters, let's say?
Different things. So first, as CSR Europe then, but also indirectly drive sustainability, we provide what's going on in this regulatory framework to our members. We provide the intelligence. But what we also try to do, especially towards the European Commission, is bring the practical intelligence from the companies, the practical experience from the companies to the European Commission. Also trying to bring them to the mine sites, to understand the difficulties and the challenges and the potential, etc., so that the policy making is kind of adapted to the situation. And we sometimes fail and sometimes are a little bit more successful in it. But that's one thing, is this policy dialogue. Second then is, once there are certain policies, be it on sourcing materials or other supply chain issues or on other topics on the sustainability agenda. So how do you meet the requirements? Are they embedded in your processes? That's the second thing we provide to our company. So there are benchmark tools and sharing and learning sessions and etc. for companies to apply, to implement, to integrate sustainability in the management process. And then the third element that we do is about collaboration, because collaboration is a nice word, but it's not so easy, especially in multinationals, but also in any people. Collaborating is not that easy. You need to build trust, you need to build a common engagement, a common target, you need to go step by step, etc. Drive Sustainability exists now since more than 10 years, and it evolved from 5 to 6 OEMs now to 18. It's a little bit herding cats. It's not that easy. You have to keep them and moving, but it's important because you can have more impact if they do it together than they would do it alone. So that's the third offer we do. So policy engagement, the integration into their own business processes, and the collaboration, incubation and facilitation. Those are the three elements I would describe now on a Wednesday afternoon, CSR Europe activity.
Okay.